Let me tell you a story about an almighty king with a magic sword. And when you own a magic sword, it kind of depends on whether it's stuck in a rock or not, you also need a glamorous chariot. Welcome everyone to a new review here on edsautoreviews, where I present to you the 1985 Excalibur Convertible. Excalibur cars are so-called Neoclassic cars. One of my earliest videos on my channel goes a bit deeper into the general history of these cars, and you can watch it if you like. In any case, there are quite a few companies that build Neoclassic cars, but Excalibur is the first and the original. And so what is a Neoclassic car? Well, as you can see, it is a car that has the looks of an old car, but the underpinnings of a modern day car. So the engine, the transmission, and the brakes, etc. are all from a modern day car. And I say modern because this car was built in the 1980s, so this is essentially already a classic car in and on itself. The story of Excalibur begins in the early 1960s. Studebaker, one of the smaller American car companies that always struggled to fight the big boys of the auto industry, wanted to grab the attention of the general public at the big motor shows. Big boss Sherwood Egberts asked one of his lead designers, famous industrial designer Brooks Stevens, to just go nuts and build something special. Stevens was inspired by roadsters of the 1920s and 1930s, and the Mercedes SSK Roadster in particular. He also had a 1928 SS Phaeton in his garage, and Studebaker was also the official importer of Mercedes in the US, further supporting the Mercedes connection. After tinkering around, the Studebaker SS was ready for the show. Stevens called it a contemporary classic, old looks, modern tech. Now I'd love to have dinner with Stevens and ask him why he came up with what I regard as a radical idea and design for the time period. It were the 60s after all, a time when modern and futuristic design was all the rage, and no car company had really looked back at their past for inspiration. Yet. And so, whoa, was that thing here the entire time? Well, whatever. And so, if you want to talk about this car, then you have to talk about this car. This is a 1935 Rolls-Royce, and I'm not saying that this car right here is directly inspired by this car right here. You have the Mercedes angle on these cars, Mercedes SSK and the Roadster from the 1930s, but you can certainly see right next to them, side by side, that this car is obviously influenced by cars from the 1930s. So, let's have a little comparison between the two. Let's start with the similarities. The untrained eye might actually be fooled and think that the Excalibur is straight from the 1930s. Much like the Rolls, the car has a vertical grille, exposed front and rear fenders, and the typical freestanding headlights. Upon closer inspection, both cars have a proud hood ornament, one of which is the Spirit of Ecstasy and the other one a magical sword, and also turning lights placed on top of the front fenders. But that's where much of the similarities stop. For instance, the doors on the Rolls are rear-hinged or suicide doors, whereas the Excaliburs have front-hinged doors. The interior of the Rolls is plain and simple. The interior of the Excalibur mimics that of the Rolls, but has a lot more modern-day creature comforts. The Rolls has an integrated taillights on the rear fenders. The Excalibur has freestanding units. The Excalibur has wire wheels for that sporty look as opposed to the Rolls with the flat disc wheels, and last but not least, the Rolls has plain and simple bumpers, whereas the Excalibur has bumpers that seem to have come off a prison gate. Unfortunately, Studebaker's management found a car such as this way too risky for regular production, and with an impending bankruptcy in sight, the car and Studebaker as a company was cancelled. And yet here I am, standing right next to the successor of the Studebaker SS. What happened? Good question. Stevens started up his own company and rebranded the Studebaker SS into Excalibur. What started out as quite a modern and powerful roadster that stayed very much true to the original cars of the 1930s changed throughout the decades and turned into a more of a luxurious and decadent grand tourer with ever more luxury trappings and, above all, kitsch. But that didn't matter because whereas the first cars were radical and often misunderstood, in the course of the 60s, 70s and 80s, neoclassic and baroque styling became more mainstream in the USA, better known as the Brougham era. If you had money, you bought a car such as the Lincoln Continental Mark III or the Cadillac Eldorado. If you really had money, you sent it to a custom coach builder to turn it into a gaudy pimpmobile. And if you had really money, you bought a pimpmobile straight from the factory, like a Stud's Blackhawk. And if you really had money, you bought the real deal, an Excalibur. Excalibur used a system of series. Every 5 years a new series would come out that would be an updated version of the previous series. And with the update came, new engine, new luxuries, complied with the latest safety and regulation rules, and also tried to keep up with other luxury cars. This particular car is from the mid-1980s, and I believe I'm correct when I say that this makes this a Series V. And so let's have a look at what you got when you decided to pay 50,000 bucks back then, which is adjusted to inflation over almost 200 grand today, for a car that sure did come with its own custom bodywork, but was pretty much a parts bin underneath. The parts bin starts in the otherwise beautiful interior. I am greeted by a dashboard that is made of the finest, I believe, real wood, kind of the same wood that you would use at a table that you would snort coke off. I mean, it was the 80s after all. But much of it, what you see around you, is pretty much standard stuff, mostly from GM. The door pull right here is from GM. The chrome mirror is from GM. The outside door handle is from GM. The same goes for the center console. The shifter is for some quite familiar because it is from GM. Much of the parts come from Chevrolet, including the Chevrolet Camaro and the Chevrolet Corvette. But that's not everything, because down here in the middle I also have a window control, which is also from GM. The seat belts are also from GM, and also this heater control unit is probably also from GM. But not everything is from GM, because guess what? The front turning signals are those from a Volkswagen Beetle. So imagine paying 200 grand for a car that comes with Volkswagen Beetle turning signals. The side pipes here are fake, although they used to be real on some earlier models. And if we look under the hood, let me open it up for a moment. The side pipes are fake, although they used to be real on older models. The spare tire, however, is actually real. And if we look under the hood, we find a Chevrolet engine. The tail lights are from a motor scooter, but we don't know what model. And the owner of the car had a hard time finding a replacement part for the electric motor for the electric windows, which actually turned out to be a Chrysler unit. And so the whole parts bin discussion leads to an interesting paradox, because back in the 1970s and 80s, if you wanted this, then you bought this. Because back in the 70s and the 80s, cars like this Rolls-Royce, were already very expensive to buy, let alone maintain. Parts availability for a car like this was just absolutely insane, and so these were very hard to maintain. Not with a car like this, because it certainly has the looks of an old car, but the modern tech underneath, like I just explained. And so ease of service was also a big part of selling these cars. But that makes it rather interesting, because, as I said, much comes from GM, but also some part from some other car makers. And so when you have to service this car, like from today's point of view, it is a bit difficult, because you have the car, but if something breaks on the car, the first thing that you have to realize is A, what part is it even? B, from what car manufacturer is it made? C, is this car manufacturer still alive? And D, are the parts still available? So what you were trying to avoid by buying this car in the 80s are the exact same problems that you currently face today, as with this car back in the 80s. But luckily I don't have to worry about any of this, as I don't own the car, but I do get to drive it. Time for a little drive in the Excalibur. Really interested in how this thing drives. Okay. The steering wheel is really small, the footwell is really small, the pedals are really small, which is interesting considering it is a huge car. The suspension is soft, it drives rather smoothly,
And the thing is, and this is a bit of a long story, I not long ago met up with a viewer from the United States. He owned a Packard from the 1930s. Long story short, he wanted that Packard over to Europe to go on a 2-month tour. And although I did not drive the car, it was interesting to sit in a 1930s car. I found it that the dashboard was very close to your body and the footwell was also very narrow. It's kind of different in a car like this. There is lots of space for your legs. It's not as cramped as I thought it would be, but it's still really interesting. You've got quite a long hood right in front of you. Now the car looks like it's from the 1930s, but it doesn't drive like a car from the 1930s, obviously. But since it's pretty much GM parts bin from the 70s and the 80s, I thought it would drive much like a land yacht. But to be fair, the steering is quite heavy, not as light as, you know, some of those land yachts. And it is pretty easy to drive, actually.
The Excalibur story lasted quite some time, but by the 1990s a combination of factors ended the fairy tale. Things like trying to keep up with regulations in combination with an ever higher retail price made the cars increasingly harder to justify. And consumer taste also changed as the cars were increasingly seen as gaudy and gimmicky. In total, some 3,500 Excaliburs have been made and are well recorded. Still expect to pay steep prices for some of these, although not so steep as the original retail price. Much like the stretch limos of the 1980s with their mini bars and whatnot, the Neoclassic cars were originally seen as aspirational cars, but are now often considered bizarre or even a joke, like a clown or a cartoon car. Think Scrooge McDuck or Cruella de Vil, which in fact owned a Panther de Vil, which is also a Neoclassic car. It's not the first car you think of when you want to buy a classic car, because you really want to be caught in one of these and keep a straight face when you say that this is your daily driver. These cars are great for the extra magic on a special occasion, like a party or a wedding day.
And now that I'm talking about wedding cars, I want to thank 123 Trouwauto or 123 Wedding Cars for providing me with this opportunity to review one of their cars. If you are located in the Netherlands or ever find yourself in the Netherlands and just happen to have a wedding that weekend, why don't you give them a call or go to their website? The link is somewhere in the description or somewhere in the screen. They have all kinds of cars, including a bunch of Ford Mustangs, Mini Coopers, Ford Model A, Rolls-Royce, and of course this very Excalibur. Also, thank you for watching and see you in the next video. Now, where did I put my magical sword?